This episode is brought to you by the free crash course, Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, happening the week of September 18th. To sign up, look for a link in the show notes.
A lot of people will talk about differences in preference, like learning styles, for example, learning visually versus auditorily. Well, it turns out that that's a preference, but it doesn't really change our ability to learn. So a lot of the individual differences that we talk about aren't usually about differences in our abilities to learn or what the mechanisms really look like.
What does it take to be an effective learner? And how does a neurodivergent person's experience differ from that of neuronormative people? What are some study methods that will work specifically for their brains? What role does confidence play in the learning process? And also, do you fancy yourself a good multitasker? Well, do we have news for you? Today, it's a study in studying, straight ahead on episode 187. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
I often have the privilege to work with school districts and help their educators learn to provide neurodiversity-affirming supports for their students. And every time we're done with the training, I hear their enthusiasm about taking those practices back to their classrooms and how thrilled they are to have a better understanding of their neurodivergent students. Well, I'm super excited to tell you about an upcoming event that you are invited to attend. The third week of September, we are going to be holding a series of live events for educators. We're calling it a crash course in creating neurodiversity-affirming schools. I'm going to be joined by my friends and fellow expert educators Amanda Morin and Sarah Kesty to provide 3 live workshops for you to join. You'll have a chance to ask your questions and to interact with the other teachers who are there. If you can't tell, I'm really excited about this and I would love to see you there. If you want to make sure that you don't miss any of it, or at least have access to the recordings, head on over and click the link in the show notes to get yourself registered. Oh, and if I didn't mention it, this is all free to our listeners. One more quick thing. We need a favor, and it will only take a couple of minutes. There's a link in the show notes to a brief survey, and it's designed to help us get to know you better. The more we know about our audience, the more effective we'll be at picking subjects and guests that are interesting to you. There's no identifying info, and we value your privacy and will always do our best to protect it. So take the survey, and it will help us to help you. Thanks in advance. Our conversation with Dr. Cinthia Nebel is straight ahead.
On a previous episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Even before you seek that professional advice or consultation, evaluation, etc., you could start by having a conversation with your kid and have that conversation in a calm way. You know, if you seem stressed and scared or panicked or angry or upset, then you're going to convey that to your kid as well. You could just start by asking some questions like, how are you doing? What is on your mind? Share a little bit of your experience and model to your family that it's okay to go through difficult emotional experiences. And we all do sometimes. You know, sometimes we're so determined to show our kids that we're there for them that without realizing it, we may also be giving the message it's bad to be rattled or it's not okay to be upset.
That's episode 110. Find it in your favorite podcast app.
Today, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Cinthia Nebel to the podcast. Cindy is a cognitive psychology scientist who studies human learning and memory and is co-author of the new book, Ace That Test, A Student's Guide to Learning Better. And also, this is something new on the podcast, Cindy is someone I've known since high school. So, Cindy, thank you for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. This is exciting.
One of your goals through your work and now through this book is to make complex science accessible and relatable to everyone. Can you tell us just a little bit why you feel like this is such a vital aspect of cognitive psychology and what you've kind of done to work toward that goal.
Yeah, so I, in particular, work with a group of other cognitive psychologists. We call ourselves the learning scientists. And all of us kind of at around the same time, we were all in that just postgraduate time where we realized that we know a whole lot about how people learn. We know a lot about basic processes of learning and memory, perception, attention, but the vast majority of that gets written up and put in academic journal articles and no one reads it. And there is such good information about concrete strategies that folks can be using to learn a lot more. And so all of us just kind of came together with this really common passion. And so we got our start on Twitter, to be honest. Late at night, one of our co-founders was tweeting at students who were talking about struggling studying for their tests. And from there, people were like, this is great. You guys should have a blog. And that's when I joined in. I saw the first couple blogs and I was like, I want to be on this bandwagon. This is fantastic. And that was in, March of 2016. And from there, it's just exploded. But all of it is a labor of love. So we do all of it because we're passionate about it. So now we have a podcast, the blog that comes out weekly with our blogs and guest blogs. We have videos and posters, and we do talks and workshops all over the world. So just lots and lots and lots of ways that we are just really trying to get that knowledge into the hands of folks that could be helped by it.
You know, a lot of our listeners actually share our episodes with the young people in their lives, whether that is their children or their students. And I was actually thinking that this episode is probably going to be a great one for them to share because the strategies that we're going to talk about are some that they can put to use right away. So I'm really hopeful that they'll be able to share that because I know when I work with my clients, if they're struggling in school academically and they're feeling frustrated with themselves, it can be hard to convince them to try different methods for learning and studying. I'm curious, as someone who studies how people learn, what are some of the things that you've learned about variability between learners? What are some of the things that most learners have in common, and where are there some differences?
So the vast majority of learning is actually pretty basic neuroscience that looks the same down to very, very basic organisms up into humans. And it's not so much how we learn that is that different. We have very different motivations across individuals. And then we have very different background knowledge. And it turns out that background knowledge piece is what creates individual difference more than anything else. So a lot of people will talk about differences in preference, like learning styles, for example, learning visually versus auditorily. Well, it turns out that that's a preference, but it doesn't really change our ability to learn. So a lot of the individual differences that we talk about aren't usually about differences in our abilities to learn or what the mechanisms really look like, so much as preferences that we have. And that's true for the motivation stuff as well. But the background knowledge is critical. And a lot of what we talk about, a lot of the strategies that we talk about are really about building up background knowledge and then accessing it quicker and more efficiently. Because when we do see individual differences, a lot of times what we're really looking at are effective use of working memory and how quickly and easily and even like how much capacity people have, how easily they can focus, but really all of it is impacting that working memory. So if we can get folks to have richer prior knowledge and then to be able to get to it quicker and easier, then we can kind of bypass any differences that we have in working memory.
You know, there are always those kids who learn really quickly and maybe have rarely needed to study. But it seems that everybody at some point gets to this place where they really have to work on some of those things, and maybe they haven't built those skills. But this is a strategy and a skill that people can learn, they can practice, they can develop over time, right?
Absolutely. So you're right that we do see these individual differences in as far as like how quickly people can pick stuff up. And some of that has to do with working memory differences. Some of it also has to do with folks kind of like picking up on some of these effective strategies on their own. That's true for me. I look back and I'm like, oh, I was doing good things and I had no idea. And then I was doing some really bad things too, right? But you don't realize that until later on when you dig into this stuff. But yeah, there are some folks that pick up on some of these things themselves and some that don't. But you're right. There's only so far you get without really needing to use some effective things that the very stereotypical cramming is just no longer going to be effective forever if you get into more and more dense material.
Effective learning a lot of times requires not only being mentally in a space and emotionally regulated so you can learn, but also in an environment that is conducive to learning. And I think for neurodivergent learners, sometimes this can be tricky because an environment that might be just fine for other people isn't a good fit for them, maybe because of some sensory needs or different things that are influencing them. Are there any myths or misconceptions about what works best for creating an environment that is conducive to learning?
A lot of people think that music in the background is a good thing for learning, or even other kind of background noise. The research shows, at least for neurotypical individuals, for sure, and I imagine the same would be true for neurodivergent individuals, but maybe it would be even heightened for them, is anytime there is language in whatever that background noise is, it can be highly distracting. Our brains are sort of hardwired to process language. So even if it's music, but there are words in the music, our brains automatically just pick up on that. And we are over there now paying attention to that music that has the words in it. But the same can be true about people talking in the background. Now, some individuals are able to block that out a little bit better than others, but it is true that across the board, individuals study better, learn better if the background is not with language. So you could have music on in the background, but that music should be like classical or ambient or something that isn't going to be processed in the same way that we would just automatically process language.
I know for me specifically, and I tend to be really sensitive to sounds, but if I'm trying to do anything that feels like it takes any sort of cognitive load, I have to wear my noise canceling headphones. And usually I do kind of the ambient noise, like some of the music, like, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And that's helpful. But more than anything, it's more to just tune everything else out than it is to actually have something to listen to.
That's right.
It's more kind of like a white noise function. But I find that having that tonal differences of the music is better than just white noise because it actually blocks out more of the variations of other noise in the environment.
So I suffer from a little bit of tinnitus. And so I can find that very distracting. Like silence is very loud in my head. But even if we're talking about cognitive load, like the idea that I've got, the list of things I have to do the next day playing through my head to try to go to sleep at night, I find the exact same thing to be true. If I can play some ambient music, the different tones kind of, my attention is focused there instead of focused inward on all the things.
The Neurodiversity University is presenting a free week-long crash course on creating neurodiversity-affirming schools. The event is happening the week of September 18th and will be conducted by Emily Kircher-Morris. There will be expert guests including Amanda Morin and Sarah Kesty, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, interact with other attendees, and most importantly, take usable ideas back to your classroom. Again, the event is the week of September 18th, and it's free. All you need to do is sign up. There's a link in the show notes. The event is a service of the Neurodiversity University, who, like this podcast, is a division of the Neurodiversity Alliance.
So speaking of myths or things that people think they are aware of but maybe aren't, I want to talk a little bit about multitasking, because we're all pulled in so many different directions today with notifications on our phones and trying to get a million things done all at once. But I know that no matter how much I try to tell my clients this, sometimes they just simply don't believe me. They think that they are the one person who is able to successfully multitask. And maybe I'm interpreting it incorrectly, but can you talk a little bit about multitasking?
So tons of research, especially on individuals who think they are excellent multitaskers. And all of that research shows that no doubt no one is a good multitasker. We're all really bad at it. But here's what that research really looks like. It's when you are genuinely trying to do two things at once. So that is, I'm trying to study while I have a Netflix show going in the background or something, like two things that you're genuinely trying to like pay attention to at the same time. For me, it's probably like sitting in a meeting while also answering emails. Like, nope, you really cannot do both of those things effectively at the same time. In today's world, it's oftentimes like a Zoom meeting while the chat is going. Those are two different things, and you literally cannot attend both of them at the same time. No one can. And so what we see is that when people think that they are effectively multitasking, essentially what they're doing is rapidly task switching. So they're paying attention to this for a second, then paying attention to that for a second, and back and forth. And what we find is that every time you switch tasks, there's a cost. There's a cost to attention in one place or the other. Like as you're switching, you're losing something. And so you can't do both things at the same time, even though it feels like you're doing that effectively. So the suggestion is whenever possible, do one thing at a time, right? And you'll be much more effective and efficient at it, right? Nobody wants to be spending 4 hours studying for a test because they were watching Netflix at the same time when they could have just spent like an hour.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily talking about project management, right? Which is this idea of having multiple things to do at one time. Instead, we're talking about multitasking. So if you're ever, in a job interview and somebody asks you like, are you a good multitasker? Don't start explaining to them how multitasking is a myth. Instead, much better to say, yes, I'm excellent at project management, because people mean two different things.
Right. So I'm curious because there are a lot of study methods that are underutilized and some that are used too much and perhaps ineffectively. So I want to just start off and ask you about some of the strategies that are used too much. Are there some study methods that everybody wants to use but just really aren't very effective? Like, what are some tools that maybe we should help people take out of their toolbox so that they don't rely on them as much?
So there's a couple of answers to this, but the most clear one that is used the most is rereading. That it is the most frequently used study method out there, that folks just reread and reread and reread books or notes or whatever. And the evidence really shows that one reread can be helpful if you didn't pick it all up the first time. But even then, it's probably pretty much a waste of time to reread at all. There are other strategies. Not that you shouldn't, read once and be done. That's not what we're saying. But there are other strategies that are so much better that rereading, usually you're losing most of that material within a week. It is just gone. And it was just a total waste of time. There are other things like highlighting that tend to be pretty ineffective. People don't do it very well and then don't go back and use their highlights very well. So that usually isn't a great strategy either.
You describe in the book, there's a little anecdote about an experiment that was done with two groups of people. I believe that one of them was asked to just reread a passage a few times, and then maybe a different group was asked to do something else. Do you remember that anecdote specifically?
I do. It's a classic study that we talk about. So in particular in that one, yeah. So one group was asked to reread, and the other group was asked instead to retrieve. So basically, they read it once, and they were given a blank sheet of paper and asked, just what do you remember? And this is one of the most effective strategies that we have. The act of bringing something to mind strengthens that information. It organizes that information. And it's just a much better use of time. So we find that essentially that practice of bringing information to mind is practice for bringing information to mind. So if you want to do that later, it's better to practice exactly what you're going to need to do. So in that study, the other thing that they did, besides just seeing how much people remembered later, they also asked them how confident they were. This is one of the most important things I think that comes out of this is folks who reread feel like they are learning a lot as they're rereading. It's probably why they're doing that. But then when we look at their actual performance, they're almost always very overconfident, meaning that they're the people who go, I don't understand. I studied so hard. I know that I knew it, and then I didn't do well on the test because they were super overconfident because rereading makes you feel like you really know it. But if you're retrieving that information, you really find out what you do and don't know, which can help you go back and review what you need to review and just helps you to have a much better sense going into a test of how well you're actually going to do.
I can imagine feeling confident as you're rereading something because once you're familiar with it, you can anticipate what's coming next. It feels comfortable to you. But the retrieval practice, you might feel a little bit less confident because essentially what you're doing is you're reading something and then you're putting it aside. And so one example of retrieval practice, like you said, was basically you get a blank piece of paper and you just remember and write down everything that you can think of. And I think in the book, it even actually suggests them putting that aside and then doing it again and putting that aside and doing it again until you're kind of really recalling it strongly. It's like when they say one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it to others because you're having to then retrieve it if you have that familiarity with it.
That's exactly right. So especially the teaching to others. So it's not the active teaching necessarily, but it's the retrieving it, having to organize it with your own knowledge, having to think about how to say it in other words so that it makes sense to somebody else. All of those mental tasks are really, really good for learning. So yeah, you're exactly right. It's that retrieval. So you mentioned the repeated retrieval, right? The doing it multiple times. It is true that you do want to make sure that you retrieve multiple times. Like if somebody's using flashcards, for example, and they get it right once, and then so they're like, okay, got that one, and they throw it onto the deck. One time getting it right doesn't necessarily mean always getting it right. So it's always a good idea to keep those things in the deck, right? To continue to try to retrieve more than once. You probably want to try to retrieve more like 5-ish times before you feel like, okay, yeah, I know that. I can probably move on to other things.
Flashcards are another one that are really tricky though, too, because it can devolve into just rereading.
That's right.
I'm going to look at this thing and then I'm going to look at what's on the back. But the retrieval part is where you're actively recalling the information and then checking your work or doing it with somebody else who can check in with you about it as well. And so we have to be careful about how you're even using that type of a strategy too.
That's always my recommendation for any retrieval strategy is write it down. Whatever your answer is that you think you've got, write it down. So that way you make sure that you're actually engaging in that. And actually, if you're getting it wrong, that's not a bad thing. It turns out retrieval practice with feedback is every bit as effective whether you're getting it right or wrong. So if you're doing flashcards and you're writing things down and you're getting them wrong, the very act of like that effortful, like thinking about it, trying to search for the answer, thinking about things that are related to it, all of those things are helping you to remember the right answer down the line.
Are there any other really high leverage strategies that people maybe don't think of or realize are available to them? Like what are some of the best kept secrets in study habits and learning?
I put 2 strategies above all others because I think they are, I don't want to say the easiest to implement, but they can be used for any materials at any time. They're the best. So retrieval practice is one of them. You can use it for anything and you should use it a lot. The other one is spaced practice. And really putting these 2 things together is very, very powerful. And so spaced practice is just the opposite of cramming. So we've got lots of research. It is not about more time. So I always want to make sure that's really clear. I am not saying study more. I'm saying study differently, which means that instead of spending, 3 hours the night before an exam studying, spread that out over the 3 days before, 1 hour a night. And you'll learn more. You'll do better on the exam. So it's not about more, it's about different. And so with spaced review, there's a lot of different things that can go into this. Obviously, if you have something in particular that you're getting ready for, you can space out your preparation for that thing. But more than that, we recommend that very early, like we're talking middle school, for sure high school, absolutely in college. Students aren't always readily taught in school that studying is a good idea, right? They complete homework, they complete tasks, but they don't necessarily spend time reviewing material. And as I said before, background knowledge is so critical, right? If you have more background knowledge, you're going to learn faster and better than the other people who don't. So reviewing material is kind of critical. It's really, really important. It can put you ahead of the game in so many different ways. So our advice is always schedule it, find time, make it a habit. 5 minutes before you go to bed at night, spend some time reviewing something that you learned. And it doesn't have to be what you learned this week. It doesn't have to be what you learned today. In fact, better if it's longer, right? If it's been a while since you've seen that, even better to try to review that material. But schedule it in somewhere. And it doesn't have to be a lot of time. Like I said, if 5 minutes is what you have, great. But if you have after dinner every night, I'm going to spend 15 or 20 minutes going over my notes from last week and last month or whatever that makes sense for the age group that we're talking about, do that. But make it a regular habit to just kind of review things over time. And when you do that review, retrieve. So instead of just opening up and rereading, cover up half the notebook and see if you can retrieve what's under your hand or whatever, right? Or open up to a page, see what the topic was, put it away, and try to write down everything you can remember about that topic. Even if it's very little, you go back and you read it, now you've got feedback. And so you're much more likely to remember that over the long term, which will probably be helpful later in life that you don't even know about yet.
Let's talk a little bit about self-belief, or the flip side of it, which is self-doubt, which can all affect success. Can you share a bit about how those factors can influence the learning process, and perhaps maybe what parents or educators might be able to do to support those aspects of the learning process?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research looking at self-efficacy. I mean, this research goes back into the 1970s. Showing that one of the most important factors, particularly for motivation, so that is like for persistence, is believing that you can succeed at any given task. So we're not talking about sort of like broad self-esteem necessarily here, although that is a part of this. We're talking about my belief in my ability to do this thing. And that might be different for math than for English, right? I might have higher belief in myself when it comes to English than it does for math, or vice versa, right? And so what we see with self-efficacy is that there are 4 components that seem to influence self-efficacy that can be influenced by yourself, or you can influence other people's self-efficacy. And so those 4 things are, number 1, previous experiences, right? If somebody's been successful in the past, they're more likely to believe that they can be successful. But it's also a perception. So if previous successes are highlighted for someone, then they're more likely to believe it, right? So even if they haven't been recently successful, they're feeling down on themselves, but somebody says, "Don't you remember? You've done this before. I know you can do it again." That is helpful, right? To be thinking about previous successes. The second is vicarious successes. So that is seeing the experiences of other people who are like them, who have been successful, and again, having that highlighted for them, like, hey, look, so-and-so could do this, so I know you can too because you guys are so much alike. The third is messages from others, which is basically what we're talking about right now, which is, I know you can do it. And therefore, you're more likely to believe you can do it than if you have people telling you that you can't do it. And then the last is psychological or physiological state. And this one is maybe a little less clear how someone can influence it, but it means that when we're sitting down to any kind of learning task that's going to require that kind of persistence, we want to make sure we're doing that at a time when we are at our best, right? So this is why you might not persist as long if you're studying at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? Because you're tired. Or if you haven't gotten enough sleep the night before, or if you're hungry, if you're just sad in general, right? Any of those things are going to play into your self-efficacy at any given moment, your belief in your ability to succeed. And so there are certainly some things there that folks can influence. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about self-efficacy is there have been some studies done looking at self-efficacy and showing that motivation, that persistence really does impact performance. I mean, so we do have kind of a direct correlation here between I believe I can succeed and I can succeed. So there was one study that was kind of cool that a professor just like did those 4 things I just mentioned in emails after exams. And sure enough, the students who got the self-efficacy emails did better on the next exam. And this is like randomly assigned. It's not anyone's actual ability to succeed. It's someone saying, I believe in you. And that goes a really long way.
Wow, that's amazing. This has been such a helpful conversation, but this brings us to my last question, which is this. If you were speaking directly to a student who is struggling and needed some ideas of how to get through that frustration or how to persevere through those feelings, what message of hope would you want them to hear?
I think I would say that learning has far more to do with the tools in your toolbox and using them in a way that is most effective for you than it does with your individual ability. And so the best way to overcome any kind of difficulties or challenges, pull another tool out of that toolbox, learn a little bit more about how to learn effectively, and then try it and see what works best for you. And know that, again, it's not about you, it's about the tools that you're using. And everybody is using different tools when they come to any kind of learning situation. So find the stuff that works for you and you'll be on even playing field with everybody else.
Dr. Cinthia Nebel, co-author of Ace That Test, A Student's Guide to Learning Better, and fellow St. Charles West Warrior. Thanks for being here today.
Woo! Thanks so much, Emily.
So very often we forget, especially with our bright students who seem so smart, that they might really lack some of the basic skills that are necessary to be successful in school. There are definitely some kids who are able to figure this out naturally, but for a lot of our neurodivergent kids, not so much. Either they've never had to study before, or their executive functioning difficulties hold them back, or they have a sense of learned helplessness. Providing explicit information and instruction to young people about how to do the things we think they should be able to do is often the key to helping them. We teach so many academic skills, from how to write an essay to solve an algebraic equation, but we often neglect to take the time to offer the same type of logical instruction for things like study skills. So, let's do our best to find the opportunities to help them build these skills. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Cinthia Nebel. You can find information about her and her body of work in the show notes. And don't forget our free week-long crash course on creating a neurodiversity-friendly classroom. If you're a teacher or you're involved in education in any way, you should absolutely join us the week of September 18th. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening. And we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.